by the end of this, you should be able to then, following from those aims, apply the concept of personality as a tool. It is a concept, it is an idea. It can be utilized to help make sense of our practice, to help make sense of situations that we encounter. And that's kind of what hopefully you can do after this. This is not a session on, making you a clinician and you're going to be diagnosing, personality disorders. That's not the aim at all. It's just to be able to deploy some of what's presented today in your work. So in the feedback, it's helpful if we do achieve that, it's good. Let us know. If not, that's also important. The next learning outcome is to understand the diagnostic label of personality disorder, along with its core features and associated patterns. This is a label. It is something that is deployed to help understand people. It doesn't define people. It's a diagnostic label. So hopefully you can understand what that label means, which will then in turn help you to, apply it appropriately. The next outcome is to apply aspects of personality disorder as a conceptual tool in your everyday work. I think I've repeated that, but that's just kind of making it more focused on your actual practice, what you're doing every day. And then finally, to understand the implications, positive and negative, of deploying clinical concepts in practice. It's really important, again, when utilizing this knowledge and this information, to also understand the implications of it, positive and negative. So hopefully we'll be able to, you'll be able to do that at the end of the day as well, okay? Some things just to bear in mind as we discuss the topic. This is something that should be approached sensitively. In part 2 of the presentation, I'll get into more detail why that is. But I don't know most of the people here, I don't know who has relatives or relations or themselves maybe dealing with this. So I think our comments need to bear in mind that this isn't something that's, necessarily out there. It's something that, can affect anyone and does affect a healthy proportion of the UK, citizens of the UK. It's also important to remember that often there is no single answer. So this is one way of understanding certain situations and certain ways people behave and ways people think and how we react to those people. It may be supported in our particular practice context, depending on what we practice in, but it's still highly contested. That's really important to recognize. And that's, again, that critical frame that is useful to bear in mind, that kind of frames the discussion. This is a perspective that we're talking about today. It's a perspective that can be useful, but it's not the only answer that's available. Also, progress, in these areas in our work in general is usually made through collaborations and critical understanding. So it's about working together. I approach this as a collaborative process whereby I'm helping to kind of understand this even more myself by presenting it, and your questions will help me to understand it and help you to understand it. So it is useful if you have questions to ask them, and if you have anything that needs clarity, or if there's something that you disagree with or something that you feel I've gotten wrong, that's important to share as well. We're collaborating. And then finally, the appreciation of perspectives, one's point of view or vantage point. One of the reasons why I ask for the professional labels, if you will, is to kind of understand which perspective people are approaching this topic from. And I think that's quite important. And that's vital, in our everyday practice to know where people are coming from. But in this presentation, especially, so that, again, like I said, I can calibrate the discussion to, relevant topics. Okay, so Chris has already introduced me. I won't go through this again. You can look at the slides. I will say a little bit more about my doctoral work. It's focusing on understanding psychosis amongst the African Caribbean communities in the UK by exploring the narratives of people who've successfully moved beyond schizophrenia. So again, we'll get to this later on as well. A huge part of that is recognizing that everyone has a story, even the people in this instance that we're talking about, and those perspectives need to be included into this discussion. They're not included. I don't have service user perspectives here today, which may be something you feed back on, but in my research, it's very much does play a role. So I just want to acknowledge that although there might not be that perspective presented here today, I do really value it, and it does, it is relevant and it is important. Okay, are there any questions or comments so far? Anyone have anything? No? Okay, we'll go on. So part one, I'm going to go over just the kind of clinical aspects of personality disorder. I'm just having a kind of a panic because I'm wondering if you've got the correct slides up. But we'll play it along. If not, I'll let Chris know. We'll accommodate that. So I just want to start off with some concepts that are kind of important and form the sort of core of what we're going to be talking about today. The first term is a term called Ego-Dystonic. This is normally where I'd ask if anyone knows what that means, but because we're in this forum, I'm just going to go through it. And this is kind of what it refers to is a dissonance with the ego or the self-image. And here, when I say ego, we're borrowing some psychoanalytic language, meaning your sort of executive function of who you are, your self-image. Okay, and being dystonic is just being out of line with that. Okay, so something that's ego-dystonic is out of line with your self-image, who you think you are. So some disorders fall into this category. The thoughts, behaviors, and values that we may experience or someone may experience are in conflict with the needs and goals of the person's ego or self-image. So they really do feel ambivalence. You might see that in substance misuse. Someone might really want to, stop using substances. They know that it's ruining their lives. They know that it's affecting them negatively, affecting their children. It doesn't fit in with what they want, but they can't, and thus we have the addiction. That exists in other areas as well. Someone might realize that their mood's dropped, or that they're doing something wrong. That conflict is what is the line between what someone wants to do and what they're actually doing. When that's in order, things seem to be going well, but sometimes that's out of order. So you see this as well in areas of, and it's rather controversial, but in the area of pedophilia is one place where you see this, where people sometimes will feel an attraction to sexualized children, or what are considered children, and sometimes people, they realize that, and it's a conflict. They don't want to be that person, but they're compelled to do that. And we see this a lot of times, I'm sure, in our different walks and our different encounters with service users and people with lived experience of social work. We see that sometimes people realize what's going on and they're not happy with it. It doesn't align with who they perceive themselves to be. Okay, and when that happens, when they're aware of the problem, they tend to kind of sometimes be distressed by the symptoms. So this is where we start to get anxiety reactions. If you recognize that something isn't the way that you want it to be, if you're not able to do something, you can become distressed. It can become bothersome, and that can lead to numerous other behaviors that accompany anxiety or distress. Okay, and in this, the last point to make in this is the person generally knows that they have a psychological condition and kind of find it uncomfortable. Okay, so you realize that there's something that might be problematic, something that might not align with your perception of yourself, something that might be productive to who you want to be or who you feel that you are. A simple example is that, well, sure, correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of people can relate to is procrastination, putting things off. A psychological condition whereby you don't do things. This morning, I decided for the umpteenth time that if I see something on the floor, I'm going to pick it up. Why walk past it? Why put that off? I find it uncomfortable that sometimes I wait until the last minute, as Chris and Megan and Charles can share with you, to get things done. I don't like doing that. I don't feel comfortable. But it happens, and it creates a sort of dissonance and a conflict, and I recognize that. And so there's that awareness. That's an everyday relatable example. And we all have colleagues like that, lastminute.coms, to use that example again. So generally people will recognize that about themselves, and they might justify it or make reasons for it, but they recognize that it's not how they'd like to be, and they find it uncomfortable. I find my behavior uncomfortable sometimes when I put things off or don't respond to emails. Okay. And sometimes, in contrast to that, we think the problem is out there. So what we've just gone through is what hopefully you've recognized, that going back with the ego-dystonic, it's an internal kind of recognition and acknowledgement. Okay, that's that concept. Okay, but alternative to that, sometimes people don't view the problem as themselves. So the reason I didn't get my slides on time was because I had so much work popping up, and it wasn't me. It's not because surely I'm hoping you can relate to that. That's referred to as ego-syntonic. So some disorders fall into this order. Okay, thoughts, behaviors, and values that are in harmony or acceptable to the needs and goals of the ego and the self-image. All right. So what that means is that the person experiencing these things does not necessarily think they have a problem. The ideas that they have, the thoughts, the behaviors, the values, they're in harmony, or they're acceptable to the needs and goals of the ego. And that notion of needs and goals is very, very important. What does someone need? What are their goals? All right. Because in that instance, the behaviors that someone exhibits, the thoughts that they have, the values that they portray might be consistent with what they want to do. And if those behaviors fall into the categories that we're going to talk today, we can see hopefully how problems may arise. And I just want to pause there and just ask, does anyone have any questions about this, or any comments, or would like me to repeat anything?
There is one question mark from Alexis, which was about whether you're going to be covering during the session personality disorder in relation to, if I understand the question correctly, adult learning disability.
I won't be covering that specifically, just simply because there are lots of specialist areas in which it can be applied. But if you do have questions in relation to that, because that is an important area, feel free to ask them. The point of the session is less about exploring the concepts in relation to service users, but more about exploring them in relation to our colleagues and ourselves. So the intent is to enable us to understand how these concepts and some of the things we're going to be talking about manifest in our own practice settings, if that makes sense. Does that answer your question? Okay, great. And again, if you'd like to apply it, that feel more than welcome, but that's our goal. Okay, so personality disorders fall into this latter category, the ego-syntonic, meaning that someone who is diagnosed or labeled as having a personality disorder doesn't necessarily view that as a problem, doesn't view what we're saying as a problem or problematic as a problem. Okay, and so to understand that, it's really to understand why this is such an important thing. It's really important to break down a little further and talk about what personality is. And again, this is where I'd normally ask, does anyone know what personality, or any ideas about what personality means? I'm sure we all have our preconceived notions. For the sake of the discussion today, personality refers to characteristic patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving that remain fairly consistent across situations and over time. So you'll see that, personality develops as early as in utero. Someone might refer to, oh, the baby was moving a lot, or my son was like this, or my child was like that. when they were in the uterus. They loved music, or they loved that, and they've continued to do it. So these are things that, pretty much stay consistent. We do change as we grow, as we age, as we go through the life cycle. But when we're referring to personality, we're talking about something that is fairly consistent across situations and over time. It doesn't mean that you're this way and that's the way that you are. I mean, we all act differently in different situations, or have the potential to. You act one way when you are talking to these people, you act another way when you're talking to these people. So it's not to say that we're the same across all situations, or your personality compels you to be the same way across every situation. It's more just about those relative consistencies that we encounter. So someone might tend to not talk as much consistently across situations. They're just not someone who feels compelled to verbally articulate themselves in every situation. Someone in the contrast might talk a lot. There's a very talkative person. Someone might have a positive outlook. It's really hard for some people to see the negative in loads of things. Some people see the pandemic and the lockdown as an opportunity, something and that's just how they view the world. I'm sorry, I just saw that someone can't hear. Is that from my end? Chris, are you able to hear me regularly? You are? Okay. Sorry, Alice, it might be on your end, but if you do have questions or you missed something, I'm happy to repeat.
Yeah, Mark, just to say, your sound has been absolutely consistent all the
Okay,
way through.
okay.
So
Okay.
I think, unfortunately, if there is somebody who can't hear, I'm afraid, I think it might be on your end. Yeah. But you're coming across perfectly, Mark. Thanks.
Okay, great. So characteristics, patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving that remain fairly consistent across situations and over time. Hopefully you get that bit of it. It's also very much an individual thing. So when we're talking about personality, when we're talking about these characteristics, there are cultural aspects, of course, social, familial, but the individual ways of perceiving and thinking, experiencing, expressing emotion, and relating to others, that's what we're looking at the core here. And again, the reason it's important to understand this is that this sometimes comes into conflict with other, assumptions about how people are just generally made up. Some, belief systems operate around principles that we are not individual. We cannot be individuals. We're all part of a collective. So again, when I say that there's not one way of understanding this, that's how that can be applied. We might think that someone views themselves as an individual, and they have a certain individual personality, but they might not view themselves that way as well. So that's the idea of personality. Any questions or comments on that? No, if you do, pop up, okay. So where does it become a disorder? And again, I use this in quotes. Part of the sensitivity that I refer to is recognizing that, for some it's just words, but these words carry a lot of weight. So if you can look back to the previous slide and see that we're talking about someone's individual characteristic patterns of thinking or feeling or behaving, their ways of expressing emotions, of who they are over time, and we add on the label disorder to that, hopefully you can start to see what the implications are. And that goes back to one of the, to the aims and one of the outcomes is to really understand the implications of deploying this type of language and these understanding these concepts. It's great to have them to utilize, but that comes with a responsibility to recognize the impact that they can have. So when we're talking about personality, we've established that. When we get to the notion of disorders, I'll go into a more elaborate description, but the basic idea is that personality disorders are best understood as unusual or extreme personality types which cause suffering to the individual, that should be and or others, and hinder interpersonal function. So the key the key takeaway from what we're about to dive into is not that these things happen. You know, spectrum, this is becoming more of there's a better understanding that we're all on spectrums. You know, I use the example with our students regularly, you know, and again, this is where I would ask the question, you know, has anyone here ever walked into a room and thought people were talking about them? Or have you ever heard something that's not there? Or have you ever seen something that's not there? Those are perfectly normal, regular, everyday experiences. But if they occur to such a degree that they're disrupting your ability to function, that's when we get into psychosis and these diagnoses. So we look at the same thing with autism, which is on a spectrum, eating disorders spectrum. So the sort of idea of a spectrum is very important here as well, in that a lot of the things that these descriptors and behaviors that I'll be sharing can be understood as something that most people will exhibit in some form of another at some time. What we're talking about here is the extreme. And I don't want to sound pedantic, because I know that everyone here works at the extremes of that's why we're in social services. We deal with the extremes of, you know, family issues or learning disabilities, or there are many people who function in society without the help of social services. Some might do that because they don't know they can access them. But there are lots of people who, you know, do function on their own with what could be understood as disorders. It's because they're not extreme enough to warrant outside intervention. What we're referring to today are when these behaviors, or when some of these thoughts, or when, you know, beliefs become so far down the line that it really causes suffering. That could be losing your house. It could be losing a job. It could be, you know, losing a partner. You know, just the inability to kind of sustain and maintain relationships. However, and I'll throw in the caveat, that doesn't mean that people are completely unfunctional. So you're going to encounter, I just point this out now, there will be some contradictions, and that kind of lends credo to the idea that this is still a contested field. We'll get into that a little bit more. So when we're talking about disorders, we're looking at personality, and we're saying that it's to the point, those characteristics, those thoughts, those beliefs get to such a point that, you know, it prohibits the person from interpersonal function, healthy interpersonal function, and can sometimes cause immense suffering. Okay? The more in-depth description, and I hope that you can read this, but if you don't worry if you can't, I'm going to read it through because it's really important. This is the overview of what I just described. The more in-depth description, which can be found in the ICD-11, which we'll go over in a second, is this. Personality disorder is characterized by problems in functioning of aspects of the self, i.e. identity, self-worth, accuracy of self-view, and self-direction. So hopefully you can see how that aligns with the Ego-Syntonic. And or interpersonal dysfunction, e.g. the ability to develop and maintain close and mutual satisfying relationships, ability to understand others' perspectives, and to manage conflict in relationships that have persisted over an extended period of time, 2 years. So again, this idea of this being a continuum and everyone experiencing this is very important. We all might, you know, at some point, you know, have problems with our self-worth or our accuracy of our self-view, of our direction. You know, I'm sure that that's increased for some people in the last year based on, you know, external factors. We also might not be able to get into relationships and maintain relationships with other people or some people, okay? These things do happen. Where it becomes a disorder is when it becomes so extreme that it causes suffering, and it has a long-standing pattern, okay? And in this instance, long-standing would be 2 years or more, okay? And that's very important to understand because it's quite tempting to label people immediately, you know, when something starts to pop up. Oh, this person came in, I noticed they were doing that. They must have a personality disorder. That's why I say this is not about diagnosing. The goal today is not to enable you to go out and decide who should be diagnosed with what or make recommendations. It's to understand how to deploy the concepts. So Persistence is a key here. The disturbance is manifest in patterns of cognition, so thought, emotional experience, emotional expression, and behavior that are maladaptive. Example, inflexible or poorly regulated, okay? And it's manifest across a range of personal and social situations. So again, it's not specific to any relationship or role. It's consistent across context. Much as your personality is consistent across, the disturbances that are cited here are consistent across interactions. So I might not get on with someone, or I might behave this way in one context with one person. That's different than if I behave this way across multiple contexts and with multiple people. I'll get to that question in just a second. I'll finish this, and I just saw that. The patterns of behavior characterizing the disturbance are not developmentally appropriate and cannot be explained primarily by social or cultural factors, including sociopolitical conflict, okay? An example of that is that, you know, some groups of people, members of some groups, have every reason to be paranoid of other groups, you know, Black people of the police, you know, there are, I'm sure you can go through a list of groups of people who may respond in a certain way to other groups, okay? So this means that the patterns are, you know, they're not appropriate for sociopolitical conflicts or for histories. And lastly, the disturbance is associated with a substantial distress or significant impairment in personal, family, social, educational, occupational, or other important areas of functioning, okay? I noticed there were some questions. I just want to ask, I'll look at these. What was, when I was giving an example of others experiencing a sort of perceived awareness?
Sabina's asking, when you were describing somebody walking into a room,
yes,
and feeling that they were potentially being talked about, wasn't that just a kind of normal example of self-awareness? I think
yes, that could be. Well, it's a normal example of just your audio skills. What I left out, and thank you for pointing this out, is sometimes that's accompanied by a feeling of paranoia, and sometimes people aren't talking about you. So sometimes I've walked into a setting and thought someone was talking about me, and it turns out they haven't. The idea that that's self-awareness, and I'm glad you asked that question, it can be self-awareness, but remember, we're talking about a continuum. So yes, it can be self-awareness. Where it becomes problematic, if it's persistent and inaccurate, and every time you walk into a room, you're perceiving people to be talking about you and maybe speaking negatively about you. And that's not necessarily self-awareness, it's being aware of yourself, but it's also misinterpreting cues, and it's also being informed by other things. Does that make sense? Good. Come across any research or interventions around cultural and religious views on possession and mental health? That's a great question. I think that it is relevant. I've not myself focused on looking at the role of possession and mental health. If we have time, I do have actually a wonderful story about about possession and mental health. When I was a community organizer for refugees from Sudan, and I encountered a situation where we talk about cultural understanding and, you know, cultural competence, and this, until you are put in a situation where you have to make some important decisions around that, you don't. So the literature, there is literature about sort of spirit possession. Those are more talked about with psychosis and with other disorders or other diagnoses, and not so much personality disorder. So in relation to this particular topic, I've not come across a lot of literature that that joins together discussions of spirit possession or, you know, religious belief and personality disorder. Hope that answers your question. So in short, it's no. Okay, so this is a description of what we have of personality disorder. You can see, and again, the reason that I offer these is that it's important to be able to kind of sum things up, but it's also important to be able to do kind of the deep dive. Again, if we're going to be using these concepts, if one of the aims of the session is to enable you to feel uncomfortable, or if one of the outcomes is that you will feel comfortable, that means being able to briefly explain to someone what you mean when you're using this, and also go into more depth if they start to ask you questions. Because again, it's the stuff that people have a right to know how we're describing them. And I'm speaking about colleagues as well, you know, not just people, you know, our service users or the people with whom we work. Okay. So there are different, now this definition here comes from the ICD-11, the International Classification of Diseases, the 11th edition. There's another common diagnostic system that's used in the UK more for diagnosing. This is used internationally for codification of disorders in order to articulate them, but the actual way that they're diagnosed has changed, and this is where it's going to get a little bit confusing. So this is the, I'll just prepare you for the slides. This is definitions taken from the ICD-11. There's also the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the 5th edition. The difference between the two is important to recognize. The ICD is published by the World Health Organization, which in theory is a apolitical, non-sort of profit global organization geared towards, you know, helping people understand health and making the world a healthier place. It's actually a feel-good story, emerged in the wake of World War II, when ideals were at an all-time high, I think, in the West, and it was decided that global health was important on the agenda. It does have some very benevolent sort of beginnings that could be argued now, but that's where that comes from. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual is published by the American Psychiatric Organization, which is a private for-profit organization. And I say that because this is the 5th edition. This is the 5th edition. There's been more than 5 because there was a text, I think a DSM-4 that was text revised, a DSM-3 too. So there's been about 9 of them actually published, but they're on the 5th edition. And each edition has gotten noticeably bigger with, you know, with diagnoses. They're increasingly added to. And that does raise some important issues as, is this really a clinical tool? Is this arrived at, you know, does this have the best interests of patients in mind? Or is it a revenue maker? Because these things cost a lot of money. So I want to throw that into the mix because, again, we're framing this critically. When we talk about the idea of why some people may not engage with diagnoses or why some people may not, there are some legitimate reasons. Normally, with my students, I teach a pre-AMP course, people who want to be approved mental health professionals, and there's a little introductory quiz, and we go through some interesting tidbits about how until the 80s, I think until 1980, homosexuality was a diagnosable mental disorder in the DSM. I think it was that way in the ICD until, was it 1993? There's also a diagnosis that was proposed 100 years ago, or 150 years ago now, called drapetomania. And drapetomania was proposed by a white American psychiatrist to explain why slaves ran away from captivity. So his belief was that people in America who were Black were intellectually inferior, and that actually slavery was better for them. So if a slave ran away, it meant that they had a mental disorder because they were running into a worse situation. And so I share these things because it's important to recognize that these diagnoses aren't necessarily discovered, they're created in the DSM. And that's one of the key distinctions to understand. And as we get into the second part, we'll see why that's important. But the two main things that we draw from in understanding personality disorders and defining them are the ICD and the DSM. The DSM is on the 5th edition, and this is how it separates personality disorders. So it puts them into 3 distinct clusters with 10 distinct types. I'm going to go through these. I won't spend time on each and every one. It's less important to know these, but just so you have a sense of the language. And I will explain, what these mean in a little more detail in a next section. But paranoid personality disorder, schizoid personality, schizotypal, antisocial, borderline personality. You may have heard of some of these. May have heard of all of these. Okay, these are in the DSM, the diagnoses of personality disorder that people can have. Okay, there's also histrionic personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, avoidant, dependent, and obsessive compulsive. Okay, so when we're looking at the DSM-5, this is when we get into the nomenclature, the names and terms used to talk about these clusters of behaviors, thoughts, and personality types. Okay, so this is kind of a scaffolding. You've been told what personality, you've agreed what that means, told what a disorder means. Now we get into, okay, the subdividing of the personality disorders into this. Okay, before I go into the ICD-10, I noticed there's a couple of questions.
Sorry, Mark, I just put that word you just used, I think it was drapetomania.
Oh, sorry, drape. I can.
And I'm afraid I just put something into the chat, because I just copied and pasted something which I'd found, there's some error in there, and I can't remove it. But
yeah, that's fine. Yeah, Google drapetomania. It's very interesting, and it was proposed as an actual diagnosis. You can, if you do a deep dive into diagnosis, you'll see that there's a real consistent connection between cultures and more geopolitical and specific diagnoses. For example, and we're going to deviate slightly here, but to just drive home that point, schizophrenia is commonly thought of as the most severe mental illness and mental disorder. It's in terms of psychiatric disorder, let's just say, it's the one that kind of commands the most restriction, and it's deployed to really control people when people are not in line with society and how things should be. If you now then take a turn and look at history and look at particular societies to see who's been diagnosed, what groups have been diagnosed, it shows a very interesting pattern. In the UK, for example, it was women in the 40s and 50s, I believe, then the Irish up until the 70s, and in the 60s, it became African Caribbeans. And if we look at where they were positioned within society, it's kind of interesting. In Russia, for example, during the Soviet era, political dissidents tended to be diagnosed with schizophrenia. In America, African Americans. So this idea that there's a link between, politics and mental health is very important. I'll come back into this discussion now, but that's where drapetomania fits in. And it's part of that critical understanding of what we're talking about today, that these aren't hard, fast facts that have been proved. They're ways of understanding that have been evidenced, okay? So moving on from the DSM, we have the ICD-10. Now I include this because it's the previous edition of the ICD. They're on 11 now, but a lot of it can take a while for the different sort of ways of thinking to infiltrate society and for people to pick them up. And I'll show you how when we get to what the NHS has on their website. So the ICD-10 was similar in that it also clustered disorders in a similar pattern. They were coded under F60. You had paranoid personality, a lot of this dissocial, slightly different. They replaced borderline with emotionally unstable. It was felt to be a more sort of supportive, more of a supportive kind of thing. So the idea that the ICD-10 was somewhat aligned with the DSM is really important, because while they weren't used interchangeably, there was a significant amount of overlap, and that is what is kind of commonly still used in the UK, right? However, and again, these just kind of go through the other disorders, the other labels. Clusters, as we see here, utilize a categorical approach. So as people explored and as research was done, it was realized that clustering these personalities, clustering things into type and categorizing them is a useful way. That's kind of how we think, in terms of clusters and groupings, and we group things together. And I'll read this. However, while this provides a helpful means to begin to understand the intricacies involved in the diagnosis of personality disorder, it is highly contested because of the tendency to ignore the general definition and go straight to a categorical diagnosis and the absence of any levels of severity of each disorder. So while it's useful to be able to categorize a personality disorder, what this is saying is that it loses touch with the idea that these are problems with relationships and they're problematic for the person, and it just kind of jumps into saying this is what's wrong with the person, this is what's going on. It doesn't look at, okay, these are things that are common. And what that does is it moves people further from the norm and kind of isolates and stigmatizes and can pathologize people to a greater extent. And that was seen as problematic increasingly. Within mental health, there's a shift across psychology, even in psychiatry, to more of a dimensional approach, realizing that there's lots of overlap between these different types of behaviors. So that was what was kind of identified as problematic with the two previous iterations of the ICD and the DSM. As a result, in the ICD-11, which was published, this is the 2015 edition, okay, the idea was that personality disorder focuses more on a core personality dysfunction while allowing practitioners to classify 3 levels of severity, those levels being mild, moderate, and severe. Okay, so rather than just saying someone has a personality disorder, this type, you get into more calibrating it to kind of really get a sense of what's going on. It also added the option of specifying one or more prominent traits or qualifiers. So negative affectivity, detachment, disinhibition, dissociality, anachronistia, which is rigid perfectionism, which is kind of more aligned with the OC, the obsessive compulsive kind of personality disorder we saw previously. So this idea was that rather than just lumping someone into this category and leaving them, it was more kind of calibrated to that person's situation. And that's what the ICD-11, which is the current edition, focuses on. Okay? It has a dimensional structure, so it replaces the categories, and it's based on 2 steps: to assign one of the 5 levels of severity and assign up to 5 prominent domain traits. And in theory, that can allow the treatment to be more effective. Rather than just saying someone has antisocial personality disorder, you can say someone has a severe XYZ. That then enables us to focus more on that person as an individual. Okay? So we're coming to the end of the first part, and in this part, what we've hopefully done is given you an idea of what personality is, what personality disorder are. Again, to kind of begin to sort of wrap that and pull that together. Psychological disorders, personality disorders are psychological disorders. Again, they're not. This isn't linked to any sort of biological function. It's psychological, marked by inflexible, disruptive, and enduring behavior patterns that impair social and other functioning, whether the sufferer recognizes it or not. And that kind of wraps us back around to the idea that sometimes people recognize what's going on for them, and other times people don't recognize what's going on for them. In a personality disorder, it's a part of that person's identity, this impairment, the disruptiveness, the inflexibility, to the extent that they don't recognize that that's something that's occurring. It's just a part of who they are. They don't see it as something that's wrong. Okay. Are there any
Mark, could I direct a couple of questions to you?
Yes, sure, of course.
One of them was a question from, let me just check, it was from Bolla, who was just asking about borderline personality disorder. So I noticed that, although that's a category, for example, that's identified by Mind on their website, it wasn't one of the categories that you identified from either of the classifications that you just mentioned.
I'll take us back up. The It is there on the DSM-5 is number 5. I didn't go
Oh,
through
sorry,
all
I
of them.
missed it then. Thank you.
And then it's not called that in the ICD. It's emotionally unstable personality disorder. The reason for that shift in how it's called is because what borderline initially meant was that people diagnosed with that were deemed to be borderline psychotic, or on, very much close to kind of going over the line and being into a psychosis, which is what a personality disorder is not. And that was seen as a very stigmatizing term. So in clinical circles, in treatment, that was replaced with emotionally unstable personality disorder. It's still, you can still find people using borderline, and that's why this gets confusing, because when you see, when I've just taken you through the idea of dimensions, and when I show you what the NHS uses, it's the ICD-10, so it's quite confusing. So yeah, there are differences. I'm gonna hold off on going through the specifics, because later in the slides I'm actually going to go through the different clusters that are listed, and you can find these on the NHS website. So I'll hold off on getting into the nitty gritty of that. But yeah, their borderline is included and in the ICD, that's emotionally unstable personality disorder.
And the other question was Mara asking about the relationship between personality disorders and attachment theory, and I guess that might connect with ideas about causes. But I don't know whether you want to make any comments there.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's entirely relevant. I'm not going to make the theoretical connections, but when we get into the etiology, the sort of origins of personality disorders, it will link to attachment theory. In a sense, the extent to which one is cared for in early life can impact how we develop and how we relate to people in the long term. So that's really important to bear in mind, that attachment is relevant. It's not as simple as linking, well, if you have this type of attachment, you're likely to have this type of personality disorder. That's not what we're going to do. But the role of attachment and the role of caring in the onset or the development of personality disorders should not be ignored and is entirely relevant. So the way that attachment, manifests does definitely impact how the patterns that people develop over time and how they relate to themselves and to other people. So it is relevant, but I'm not going to go into like linking, this is the attachment style that links to that, but it's a good question. It is relevant.
And then another question, and I think this relates to your account of the importance of thinking about cultural factors in the way that diagnosis takes place, or the way in which there's a greater or lesser incidences of personality disorder in the UK. But Selassie is asking about differences by gender, age, and ethnicity. Would you like to make any comment about that at this point?
Yeah, I'll give some basic ideas of prevalence. I don't unfortunately have up-to-date statistics because they're rare by gender, age, and ethnicity. It's usually just by population. It's, again, part of the reason for that is that up until recently, personality disorder has been a very controversial diagnosis that hasn't been, really incorporated into clinical research necessarily. It's increasingly done that, so there are more studies on, the prevalence among specific groups that you mentioned. But here I'll give some basic figures later on about the UK population. And there's actually, I meant to include, but there's a paper that's a global study about global prevalence that just came out as well.
And then there's one last question from Corey, which is about, you mentioned the question of people not necessarily being aware of the situation that they're in and the condition that they may be deemed to have. So Corey's question is it possible to be aware there is something wrong, in inverted commas, with one's personality, but feel unable to change it?
Yeah. I think that's a very appropriate question. And there is a tendency to speak in terms of extremes that people are unaware, but I think you're right. Sometimes people can sense that something maybe isn't necessarily wrong, but that something isn't right. You know, why does this keep happening, or what's going on? And they do, you know, people oftentimes do feel unable to change it. Where it becomes the disorder, however, is when people don't feel that way, and don't feel that there's anything that needs to be changed, if that makes sense. So someone might develop personality traits of a particular personality disorder, but again, we're trying to make sure that the concept doesn't get deployed, you know, I guess more than it needs to be. It's really reserved for people who don't see anything wrong and don't feel compelled to change. And because of that rigidity, it means it's very difficult for them to maintain relationships with other people and to kind of function in life in a healthy way. And that's kind of that's kind of the distinction. That's the line, the threshold, if you will, that needs to be maintained. Because yeah, there are aspects, I'm sure I have them of my personality that I'd like to change. You know, they're fixed and rigid and stuff like that, causes me discomfort, but they're not prohibitive of me doing a number of, you know, things. And that's kind of why we have that sort of line. Does that make sense?
I think Corrie is acknowledging
Okay.
that does make sense. So thanks for that. I mean, I'm just looking at the first part of her question in the original question. It was, is it typically the case that people aren't aware of the personality disorder? And I think what you're saying, Mark, is that actually not only is it typically the case, but actually that's part of the definition of a personality disorder.
Yeah, exactly, Chris. It is. It's one of those things where if they were aware, then you know that fundamentally changes what's going on. And again, I think it's important to recognize that this, as vague and wishy-washy as this may sound, it's a lot firmer than when it actually goes into practice, because psychiatrists, doctors, practitioners are sometimes it's a lot of guesswork, and it's highly subjective. There's no objective marker for, well, any psychiatric disorder really. There's no blood test for schizophrenia. There's no blood, you know, you can't, it's someone observing someone else and making a decision based on what we've just discussed here. So it's a dually subjective process. So the idea that, you know, sometimes it's really confusing, that's how it is. And I think, again, that's really important to recognize, because that confusion isn't just on you, the practitioner, on you, the colleague, it's on the person as well. Sometimes they don't know what to go on. So yes, exactly. It's about people not being aware, and that's kind of the line that we have to set to demarcate from, you know, everyday functioning versus the sort of what we might call pathological and dysfunctional, if that makes sense. Yeah. Good. Okay. So to kind of begin to sum up, because we're approaching our break, we're a little bit behind. Personality disorders, it's a term, first and foremost. It's most frequently used in mental health services. It falls into psychological disorders, generally characterized by difficulties in thoughts and feelings that an individual has about themselves and others. It manifests through behavior. There's no definitive consensus about the structure of personality. So again, we say personality disorders. We could go through everyone at the attending today, and I'm sure we get, you know, that many different definitions. It covers a number of broad domains. And again, back to the previous question, it represents the extreme of a continuum. That's what's important to recognize. Okay. And just to kind of reduce it, which I've been kind of suggesting we don't, but you'll see that this is how it works. Problematic, persistent, and pervasive, the three Ps. So as we move into discussion about this in the workplace, when we notice that something is A, problematic, and we see that it's B, persistent, meaning that it continues, and we see that it's also pervasive, meaning it extends beyond one or two people into different areas, different teams, different departments, different walks of life, that's when we start to maybe think it might be useful to deploy these concepts. So those are the things to kind of look at. If someone just has a bad day, we're not gonna, run around saying, oh, we might want to think in terms of concepts related to personality disorder. If these things occur frequently and they are problematic, and they are, you find yourself talking to people in other departments about something, then that's more an indicator that it might be useful to think in terms of these concepts and deploy these as conceptual tools. Okay? That's the end of part one. We have a scheduled 10-minute break, but before we do, I just want to ask if there are any questions from that, which is what could be considered kind of the more clinical, theoretical part of the presentation. Okay, if they do pop up, you feel free to put them into the chat. Do you want to break us, Chris? And
I'm sorry, say it again.
Do you want to break us and let us know when to come back and everything?
Yeah, absolutely. So it is now, let's call it 5 minutes past 3. So should we come back at 3:15? If you think 10-minute break, Mark, it's not long, is it? But gives people a chance to go make a cup of tea.
Yeah, I think so. It's best practice, and we can stretch our legs. The blood's settling now. So
all right.
See you at 15,
back at 3:15. Fantastic.
Wonderful. Thank you. We're encountering people who need certain supports and or have specific problems that they need our support with, and we, just by virtue of what we do, try to identify the cause of those problems, or at least in theory we should try to identify the cause of those problems so we can address those and rectify some of these negative and unhealthy situations. When that's unclear, the waters get a bit murkier. And again, this is why people can go through their lives with having lots of these diagnoses. If we don't know why something occurs, we really don't know how to treat it. We can look at, treating the symptoms, but not necessarily the cause. And within mental health in general, particularly coming out of British psychology, some branches of British psychology, is the notion of treating symptoms versus treating these categorical diagnoses. Let's look at the whole person, let's look at what's going on, and let's address these individual problems. So, the bottom line is that we don't know what causes personality disorders. We don't. In much the same way that we don't know what causes schizophrenia, or we don't know what causes certain types of depression and lots of these other diagnoses. It's a best guess scenario, really, and we treat by trial, which is again why someone might cycle through medications and have one prescription this week and I have another one this week and have another one this week. It's because that is really just it's kind of a trial to see which is going to be more effective to helping the person reduce their suffering. That doesn't apply to personality disorders. It's not usually medicated for it, but that is mental health in general. So one of the things, though, and this again is where we kind of dovetail into attachment, is that people who are diagnosed with personality disorders often report traumatic childhood experiences, and these run through the gamut of sexual abuse, emotional abuse, bullying, being witnesses to violence or being victims of violence, and in particular, and this is where we get into the attachment, perceived and or actual lack of nurturing. And that perceived is very important. Whether someone feels, they were able to develop a good, healthy bond and relationship with their caregivers is one of the key reported experiences that people with personality disorders often, or diagnosed with them often, often share. Okay, early experiences with important others. So a deficit in core childhood needs, and the relationship between infant and primary caregiver are very important. As an example, if I'm a parent and I have a child, well, I am a parent and I do have a child. So, my purpose and one of my roles is to ensure that the needs of the child are met: emotional, nutritional, psychological, physical, to do all of these things. And the child depends on me as a caregiver, or depends on the caregiver or caregivers to have those. If I'm not meeting those, or if the child doesn't feel that I'm meeting those, that's where we can sometimes begin to see the origins of these fixed and rigid ways of being. So, for example, and I'll link this to the actual the clusters. If I'm not, if I'm emotionally detached from my son, as a way to cope with that, he might develop a sort of aloofness or a distance from people as a way of avoiding being let down. So that's how and I think we all are aware of that implicitly in our work. Um, you know, that's how that can start. And over time, if that pattern persists, there are going to be those days where I'm just like, yeah, he's not here now, but I'd be like, he comes up and wants to hug me, and I'm on the computer, and I say, oh, go do this and go do that. Those aren't the types of, those moments don't necessarily trigger or lead to a personality disorder. But if I'm like that every time and in every facet of his life, that's where we can start to see these things develop. And that does impact how they are attached and how they are linked to their caregivers. So they might become ambivalent, if he doesn't think he's going to get the emotional nurturing that he needs. And, for those of us who are parents, your children do test you. They will wait until you're doing something that you don't want them to disturb, and they'll come up and offer themselves and look for affection to kind of gauge where they are in terms of the rest of the world, where they stack up, where they rank. And when we, how we respond in those situations are, we're programming them on how to place themselves in the world and how to relate and how to engage with other people. And so that's where we see, that's where it does meet up with attachment, and it does meet up, that's where attachment and these sort of personalities do meet up. I hope that links back to the question. I forget who asked it, but it was a great question. And that's where these two kind of become, kind of align. Okay. So the early childhood experiences, when we're discussing the etiology or the cause, oftentimes it's linked back to early traumatic childhood experiences. Trauma meaning that it lingers. It's not a one-off or a passing. It's something that's really impacted the child and has lingered with them. Okay. And now I want to get into what we're, how we start to kind of pull this into our everyday work, because this is mental health in the workplace. So it's important to begin to kind of start to link it and draw it into our workplace. And so the questions that you will hopefully, again, this would be the normal break into small groups and discuss, but what I'd like you to do individually is just, in your background processing, think of what the role of your service is. Okay. We're all involved in social services, presumably in some way, shape, or form. So we're all here to meet certain needs. And we may talk about doing it holistically, but I've not met one service that accommodates every single need. So what's the role of your service? What is it that you look to do? How is it that you relate to people? And within that, what is your role? What is your role within that particular service that you're providing within that particular organization or that structure? Okay. And what are the reasons that people come to see you as an individual? You in the collective sense, your service, but also you as a person. Why do people approach you? And what are they looking to get or to receive or to offer or to share or what have you in those encounters that you have with colleagues and service users, but more important for our discussion, colleagues? And that's where we begin to look at, how we can start applying some of these concepts. Your role will come with certain expectations. It'll be characterized in a certain way. There'll be certain behaviors that are appropriate. And we start to see, that our professional functions themselves as part of our personality also constitute, our professional functions and the way that we provide our services and our professional roles also start to constitute part of our personalities. And so that thinking, I think, is important as we move into the next phases of the discussions. Sometimes, and this is an appropriate point as well, personality disorders are associated with crime. Okay, so people who have a serious diagnosis, who have a diagnosis of personality disorder, and are also considered to pose a serious risk of harm to others or have committed violent crime, may be described as having a dangerous and severe personality disorder. This is not a clinical diagnosis, but a term that was introduced by a government consultation paper in the UK in 1999. So one thing that I think is important to point out and to remember is that we use phrases like mental health, but what do they really stand for? A great example is the Mental Health Act, which is the piece of legislation that kind of governs how we engage with people when they're detained for the purposes of mental health. In the Mental Health Act, the term mental health only appears in the title, and disorder, there's the idea that it is to engage in supporting mental health is sometimes suggested, but it's really about managing risk and managing, the risk that people pose to themselves, and more importantly, sometimes you might think, to society. So the reason I bring that up is because when we hear a term like dangerous and severe personality disorder, we might find that matriculates into our own sort of way of speaking at work and our way of talking. And I think it's important to recognize the distinction between, and this is where we get linked back to the government and stuff like that, between clinical diagnoses and terms that are used in legislation sometimes, okay? Historically, this term has usually been applied to people diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder who are considered to pose a risk to others. Such people were identified as needing to be detained for treatment under the Mental Health Act 1983 as amended 2007. Okay, so the idea, again, and the reason I used that example of schizophrenia previously, is to really show you that the way that we deploy these terms, we need to think about. It's very important, if you're using this terminology or you find it may apply, that we're not weaponizing these terms to marginalize people. That's why I don't, I mentioned I teach a preamp course. I encourage practitioners not to use the shorthand like PD or saying that person's a PD, because that puts them into a very stigmatized box. So having an understanding of what this term can be associated with is very important. It also allows us to recognize why it might be rejected and why people may not accept it. So if you're looking to frame someone's behavior, as again we get into the workplace discussion, if you're looking to discuss situations that are occurring or challenges that are arising in the workplace, and we start deploying this terminology, it might be met with resistance because of the implications and the stigma attached to it. So that's a really important part of the session today, is to recognize that these are useful terms in conceptualizing some of the challenges that we face, but we have to be aware that they carry a certain stigma, and we have to be aware that we're not weaponizing them to do something to other people or to marginalize someone for our own purposes. So there's an ethical responsibility that comes with gaining such an understanding. Does that make sense to people? I just want to check in to see if because that's a very key aspect of this and quite an important outcome to have, that people really understand that it's very important to recognize how these can and should be deployed, these concepts and this way of thinking and discussing, people. People with the DX means diagnosis, clinical shorthand. People with a diagnosis of personality disorder, that should be often struggle with relationships, and this can take many different forms. So in the workplace, especially during these times, and I think it's become the distance, I think, that we may have, kind of gained from one another by moving to social isolation, and social distancing, and that, I think that really serves to highlight the importance of relationships. And it can also, have highlighted where some relationships are strong and where others are not so strong. And in these times, you know, people who might have personality disorders or might meet some of the criteria, display some of the behaviors, this may be a real time of struggle for some of our colleagues and or service users, because the nature of the diagnosis is that they actually need the relationships to define themselves. So not having that, even if it's an unhealthy definition, can really be quite unsettling. And I think that's something that's really important to recognize as well. It's not that people don't want or need relationships, it's that they struggle with relationships. And that struggle, if it's a part of your identity, can define who you are. When you remove that struggle, you know, although it might be a relief, oh, I'm not around, you know, for the people who don't want to be a part of that, for the person whose identity or personality is defined by that struggle, you know, this can be an increasingly challenging time. So as you know, as this, you know, you assimilate this knowledge and these views that I'm expressing and the information that's provided here, I think in, you know, in the spirit of compassion and understanding, it's important to recognize that, you know, now may be a time to actually engage with someone who is who historically has struggled with relationships at work or with that, because they're not having that struggle to define themselves, and that can be the most isolating feeling ever, you know. So just a little something to kind of, you know, add to this is that this is a care and concern kind of approach. It's very important, but I think that that's something to really kind of focus on as well, is that we want to help cultivate. We don't just want to avoid you know, uncomfortable relationships. We want to cultivate and nurture and, you know, kind of contribute to the development of healthy relationships. And that's what in our, you know, to kind of deviate, you know, a little, in our at UEL or university, one of our strategic themes is relational capital, developing the capacity to relate with our colleagues, with our stakeholders, with service users, with ourselves, as a way of really helping guide us through what's quite a challenging period of history that we're living through. So that's another way that that's another level of understanding that hopefully you're tapping into, or hopefully I'm making clear. Does that make sense? Are there any questions on that? I mean, you're taking it in real time, so if there are, please just pass them on to Chris or in the chat. But I just want to make sure that that's making sense. I'm not just like talking to myself here. So please do ask. So I mentioned that there's lots of inconsistencies, and that, you know, the categorical way is a little bit, you know, it's a little bit off because it puts people into these categories. Well, unfortunately, that's what, if you go to the NHS website, which I check, this is what they do. They haven't caught up to the ICD-10 yet. And part of the reason is that requires a fundamental shift in how things are done. It means that people would have to be re-diagnosed, and people would have to this. And that's why certain things happen, such as, you know, in the United States, Asperger's is no longer used as a diagnosis. And when I'm talking about how, you know, these diagnoses aren't fixed, they're not true, this is what I mean. You've heard me for the first half of this, part one, say it used to be categorical, the DSM still is. The new ICD, which is the global sort of standard, is not categorical, it's dimensional. And now I'm coming back and explaining the second half of this in terms of clusters, which are simply, you know, essentially categories, if we're being straight. The reason being is because this is the type of language, the clinical language that's used, and this also provides a way of an easier way of understanding, you know, what is meant by what and how to identify some of the types and associated behaviors. So I'm not suggesting that this is right or wrong. This is, if you go to the NHS website, they'll link you to Mind. Mind has these up as well. So this is what you're going to find if you go out. And I do also encourage you to, you know, to look at these websites as well and see if they're updated, because they do sometimes change without massive announcements. But this is what you'll find, and this is what people find out there as well. So lots of people seek to understand themselves and attempt to make sense of their situations. That self-awareness that was referred to that was referred to earlier. People do actually engage in that. And, this is what they're encountering. So cluster A, we're looking at, and there are three, there's A, B, and C, there's A, B, and C, which I'll go through, is sort of odd or eccentric personality. And I put types here because I'm moving us away from the clinical. If you go there, it's odd or eccentric personality disorders, but I'm, flexing that a little bit to say types. So I think, it's appropriate to soften up language for the employment context. Can be thought of as paranoid, schizoid, and schizotypal. I'm not going to go into a deep dive into what each of these are. I'll just kind of go over them briefly, but paranoid, I think most people have an understanding of what that means: extremely distrustful or suspicious. Schizoid, avoid making close social contact, and schizotypal, poor social skills, delusional thoughts, and behave in unusual ways. The schizoid and the schizotypal sometimes get confused. People are like, what's that? The distinction is the schizoid avoids contact, schizotypal, they have poor social skills and behave in unusual ways. So not necessarily avoiding contact, but kind of disregard conventions when they're having that contact. And you'll notice the sort of prefix there is schiz, which is linked to schizophrenia. So if you put these together, they, eventually can lead to a diagnosis of schizophrenia if this persists and there are other criteria that are met. Okay? Cluster B, these are kind of dramatic and erratic personality types. And as we go through this, I want you to kind of start to thinking, and maybe you already have, I do know, I know someone, I've seen this, I can kind of see this. And you'll see these behaviors in, and that's why these concepts can be useful. So dramatic, emotional, and erratic. In this, we have antisocial, sees other people as vulnerable and may intimidate or bully others without remorse. Again, histrionic, swings between seeing themselves as special and fearing they are worthless. So quite the emotional roller coaster. That's kind of linked to the borderline personality disorder. That's one of the characteristics. Is there's just this swinging back and forth and back and forth. Narcissistic, swings between seeing themselves as special and fearing they are worthless. I don't think anyone embodies this more than Donald Trump has exhibited over the last 4 years. Well, his life really, but for everyone to see. This sort of incessant need to feel special, having these rallies, and then when something happens, feeling like they're not worth anything. I need to go out and have more rallies because no one likes me, and I want people to like me. And that's sort of narcissistic, and that's important because when I said before, this impairs social functioning, and it doesn't mean that people can't achieve and rise to certain positions. And in certain contexts, some of these are actually welcome traits. If you're involved in, organized crime that, includes trafficking or all these other stuff, these are the spaces that people can find to thrive with these personalities. So it doesn't mean that they cannot function and cannot be amongst us and, are unable to, meet their material needs or do what they need to do. It just means that if they're not in the context that reinforces those types of behaviors, it kind of stands out. Hopefully that makes sense as well. And that's, again, another important kind of thing to recognize. And then lastly, we talked about borderline, emotionally unstable, has impulses to self-harm, and has a very intense and unstable relationship with others. I love you 1 minute and I can't, I hate you the next minute. These sorts of types of ideas where someone's your best friend and then they can't stand you, or you're the worst enemy. That's what that sort of borderline, kind of speaks to. And finally, cluster C, anxious and fearful personality types. We have dependent, dependent feels they have no ability to be independent. Avoidant appears painfully shy, is socially inhibited, feels inadequate, and obsessive compulsive, anxious about issues that seem out of their control or messy. So need things kind of in order. They're preoccupied with orderliness, and sometimes people call them control freaks. Again, that's a good, manager, someone who, takes control and keeps things in order and does that. So, again, you can see how things function. I'm not saying managers are obsessive compulsive personality disorder, but, these certain traits and characteristics, you can see how they do fit in even in your own practice, which is why we kind of led off with thinking about what your service does, how it does it, who it interacts with, and what people expect. If you're working with a colleague who's very organized and, kind of a control freak, and, that's what the service needs, that's not necessarily a reason to start saying, oh, you're a personality. It's important to understand that context. Likewise, if you're in a position where there needs to be more flexibility and someone's like this, then we can maybe start to see how that type of, those personality traits or that personality trait could be a little bit disruptive and could be a bit more challenging. Okay. So personalities, I think, although they're, included in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual and they're part of the ICD, they're distinct from mental illness based on their onset and their treatments. So within the UK, we operate historically since about the 1980s with a very distinct biomedical way of looking at psychiatric illnesses. Well, I'm using psychiatric and mental illnesses here interchangeably. And psychiatric illnesses are seen as having a biological etiology, which is why more often than not, they're treated with medication. Their medication needs to be managed. Therapy is sometimes an aside to that or a complement. It's best practice now to, if someone is diagnosed with schizophrenia, to also engage them in CBT or at least another form of therapy. That is best practice. But the etiology is still presumed to be biological. And with personality disorders, it's not presumed to be biological. The onset is different. It's also a bit earlier. You don't develop a personality disorder later on in life. It may be diagnosed, but it's usually traceable back to early life and childhood, whereas lots of other mental illnesses or psychiatric diagnoses are not necessarily traceable back to your infancy or that. They might be linked and they might be able to, but they're not necessarily. And also the treatment. Historically, for a while, and this, it depends on where you are. Again, this shows you how inconsistent, because in the United States, where I'm from, personality disorders have been and still are treated with antipsychotics, atypical antipsychotics sometimes, which is not done in the UK. It's not treated with medication. That's not effective. You might prescribe something to help manage anxiety or to relieve an acute situation, but that's not to treat the personality disorder itself. It's to manage some of the effects of that. So there is a distinction between mental illnesses per se and personality disorders as we're talking about them today. Okay. There are a number of approaches when we're talking about treating personality disorders. So we've seen from looking at the nature of them that they can pose lots of risks. And again, here's where I'd ask what sorts of risks. Risks of isolation, risk of harm to self and others, risk of not looking after oneself. Okay. Again, when we're talking about the extremes of these, it can really put someone in harm's way. So one of the ways of coping with this is risk reduction, managing risk, being aware of the risks. It can also be looking at relieving distress, harm minimization, addressing attitudes, and this is again the cognitive aspect to it, trying to reduce the impact of what occurs for people, the self-awareness and awareness of what's going on. This is the sort of links back to the self-awareness, and looking at the resources that are available to help someone get what they need. Again, if we look back to one of the previous slides, I mentioned that early childhood trauma or some perceived or actual deficiency in care that was provided can be how these begin to manifest, and how where the onset can be located. So looking at resources that can kind of make up for that or can kind of address that is important. And again, these kind of ideas I want you to carry over as we get more and more like granular and get down to kind of everyday sort of stuff, because these are the things that these same approaches can be applied in situations that you might find yourself with a colleague who fits the bill one of these, or is demonstrating something that might be considered a personality disorder or personality type. Okay. Any questions on what I've just said? I'm approaching the last little section because this has all been up here now. How do we bring it back together? Are there any questions about any of the stuff that I've discussed or mentioned so far, or any comments?
Mark, can I field a few to you?
Yeah, sure, of course.
So Mara earlier, when you were talking about possible causes, and then you were referencing the question of attachment, Mara says she thought that she believes there is a connection, or there's evidence of a connection in some studies that shows a link between emotionally unstable personality disorder, EUPD, and insecure attachment, so that there's kind of, I think you were probably suggesting that it's difficult to draw causal connections, but she's asking, isn't there some evidence of causality? And also Alexis at the same time was asking about whether over-attachment might also be implicated in personality disorders. So I don't know whether you wanted to take those questions.
Yeah, I'll speak to that. Yes, I'm not familiar with the literature that links the two specifically, but that stands to reason. What I'm saying is that there's no definitive, if this happens, then this occurs. So if there are connections and correlations, and yes, if and an example is if the primary caregiver or the caregivers are not attentive to the children, that can lead to some of these traits becoming embedded. That evidence is there. There's evidence to suggest that happens and that occurs, both narrative evidence, statistical evidence, and what have you. So I'm not saying that there's no connection. I'm just encouraging a skepticism, or a sort of a stopping short of saying if then kind of statements, because that then impacts our practice. So when we see certain behaviors, we say, well, that's going to lead to that, and we need to stop that and do that. And that kind of gets into another concept I'm going to introduce in a minute. So I support that. I think that there's, I'm not surprised to hear that there's evidence. I'll have to do some reading up on that. I mean, thank you for drawing my attention to it. But I'm not disputing that. I'm merely stating that with that, we need to be aware that that doesn't necessarily mean that's the cause of this personality disorder. That's what I'm steering away from.
And over-attachment, I don't know if you have any comments on that idea.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not. When you say over-attachment, is that the child or the parent, or what does that mean? I mean, the short is that yes, any sort of extreme can lead to this down the road, and that's what we're talking about, the extremes. So if we're saying over-attachment to mean overbearing or too controlling, or the child is not able to exercise independence, or unwilling to exercise his independence, then yes, there's a link to that for sure.
And I thought it was also worth noting that Mara's used the term emotionally unstable personality disorder, and I think, would you deem that to be in the category, if we're categorizing, of borderline, an alternative term to describe borderline personality disorder?
Yeah, it's commonly used in practice. I mean, there's a distinction in this. You will find practitioners and clinicians, psychiatrists, who say borderline. You will find some who say emotionally unstable. Again, that's within psychiatry, within mental health work, all these discussions, psychology, all of these psychoanalysis, all these discussions are occurring. All these sorts of conversations that we're having in a sort of little micro way here are happening in journals and in conferences and in theory. So yeah, you'll find that both are used. It depends on where you're coming from. Some people prefer that because it's a more sort of supportive way of describing a certain cluster of behaviors. You know, someone might have been diagnosed with borderline and they don't want to be emotionally unstable because that doesn't sound right to them. You know, they've become attached to that. So in addition to what we're saying, and this is when I first, mentioned that I don't necessarily infuse this with a service user or a personality, someone with a personality disorder, with their views, that's an important omission from this, is that what does the person want to be called? How are they going to engage with the diagnosis? So I think any work that we do needs to take into account whether or not it's received and how it's received by the person it's being used to describe. And that's why I mentioned that if we are applying these concepts to our colleagues and to people with whom we work closely, professionals, if you will, we need to be very careful, about how we deploy this, demonstrating traits. If you're raising a concern about a colleague with a manager or with HR or with another colleague and you're having discussions about this, you want to be very careful, and you might want to think about whether or not you even use emotionally unstable or borderline to describe what you're talking about, and rather just talk about the behaviors that they're exhibiting, knowing in the back of your mind that these fall into this category. So I think the nomenclature is still being calibrated amongst professions. Like I said, the NHS information doesn't align with what's in the ICD-11 right now. So this is all, kind of floating. So that's why it's very important to be responsible. But I think that they do align, and they're often used. They are sometimes used interchangeably, but there is slight variation.
Okay. Shall we do some quick fire questions? So one, Bola's saying, can substance misuse later in life lead to personality disorder?
Doesn't lead to, based on the criteria, but substance abuse is often associated with personality disorders. So people utilize that. Again, those cause and effects jumps that we make are very important. This is usually, personality disorders are often diagnosed later in life because they need to be. You're not going to diagnose usually a 5-year-old with a personality disorder because they're 5 years old. You know, how persistent and pervasive can it be if they're only 5 and they have all these changes to go to? 25-year-old might be diagnosed. Will they be diagnosed because they started smoking marijuana or sniffing cocaine or drinking or injecting heroin? No, that's not you. That's a different diagnosis. That's a different issue that we're dealing with. And that might impact someone's psychology and someone's cognitive functioning, but it's not necessarily something that's going to lead to them being diagnosed with a personality disorder, because you have to differentiate. You have to include the substance misuse, which, if you're doing your operational diagnosis, will eliminate personality disorder because they're abusing substances. The same way, if someone comes into a hospital and they're psychotic, you have to rule out that they're having a drug-induced psychosis before you go down the schizophrenia or the organic psychosis route. So that's why, again, I encourage people to ask these questions, but also to bear in mind that we don't want to, make ourselves sort of lay diagnosticians here, because it is a process. It's very important. I'm from the States where social workers are trained to diagnose. So I was a clinical social worker. So we do diagnose, which is why I speak with some authority, but I haven't done that in 15 years. So that's waning on my end. So those are great questions. I think it's great to ask them, but the caveat is to avoid the causal statements. There's a link between substance misuse and personality, which raises the question, what's the link? The link is that sometimes people, to manage these disruptions or these relationships, will resort to utilizing substances that minimize the pain or whatever, self-medicating, if you will.
Thank you for that. And Mara, I think Mara probably is pointing out that when I may have attributed a suggestion from her that she was saying, there was evidence of cause and effect in relation to EUPD and insecure attachment. But I think what she's highlighted and clarified is that she was referring to some work by Peter Fonagy, who's looked at the connections. So that's probably a better way of representing what she wanted to say. I think that might have. There was a question about from Bola about Some people might behave in a different way to other people due to cultural and religious reasons, especially if it's not common with the way that people in that community behave. Does that mean that it could be stated that such people have personality disorder?
No, I mean, you'll find, just to go back, Peter Fonagy is great, by the way. I'd recommend that lots of people read him. He's great. I'm glad you brought him up. He's great. No, a key, what will be said, and it's kind of it draws us into the, I have to move on in a second, but it draws us into the whole notion about, can these things be applied across culture? Do they speak of universalisms? And that's a whole other debate, is how universal these are. Just to show an example, there's a South American diagnostic manual. There's a China, I have it over here, the psychodynamic. There's also a Chinese diagnostic manual. So different parts of the world see these things in different ways and have different ways of discussing them. So you'll see in the ICD and in the DSM, there's always the sort of statement that that is not consistent with culture or that. So there's always the proviso that if something is consistent with someone's culture or someone's experience, then it's usually not something that's going to be diagnosed as a mental illness, or that's one of the screening things. It still could be. There are some things that are not culturally relevant, that are part of someone's culture, you know.
Okay, I'm conscious, Mark, that you probably need to move on.
I just want to get through the...
Can I ask you one more quick question? I've just seen that, because we're almost at the end. Are there any genetic connections? Debbie's asking. Are
there any genetic connections? No, there's not a heritability of personality disorders. So if your mother had a personality disorder, you're not going to have one because of the genetics necessarily, or it hasn't been shown or suggested that you will. What is that? How that's talked about in this context is through intergenerational transmission. So it's likely, it's very possible that if a caregiver or a parent or someone, you know, primary caregiver, let's say the caregiver, because that suggests the person who's looking after the child, that behavior and that way of thinking can be transferred intergenerationally because of, and that's where attachment becomes relevant, because of the way that they interact, the way that they shape the psychology. This is where we get into Peter Fonagy, where he talks about, you know, the sort of mirror synapses and all this other stuff that really, you know, just the looks, you know, if these people, when we look at emotionally unstable and borderline, are very sensitive to looks. You know, if you raise your eyebrow or look away, what are you looking at? Why are you looking at me that way? You know, and those types of cues are started early in life by the caregivers, if that happens to be the parent. So it's not that you can test someone and say, okay, this person's genetic makeup suggests that they're going to inherit this personality type. It's more evidence suggests that if someone is configured a certain way psychologically or behaves a certain way, then that might be, and it's possible that can be transferred through their interactions with their children. And that, you know, aligns with the testimony where it said that most people who are diagnosed report some sort of childhood trauma. You know, it doesn't have to be sexual abuse. Childhood trauma can be negligence. It can be, you know, privation or deprivation. You know, it doesn't have to be physical abuse. It can be psychological abuse. That's how those things get transmitted intergenerationally rather than through genes.
And just a very quick one, Emma says, could you say anything more about the connection between Donald Trump and narcissism, and what and explain that a tiny bit more?
I could, but we'd be here all day.
Okay. All right, and then
I will just say that I should have. There's some great articles on it. If you Google it, you'll have more reading than you know what to do with. Trust me.
Okay, and then just one comment, which is that Charmaine agrees with you and says you're so right that we need to be more responsible with our language, starting with our colleagues.
Well, thank you. I do appreciate you acknowledging that, because I think it's especially in times like this, it's vital. You know what I mean? That we are working together. So I appreciate you acknowledging that. And I wasn't being flippant about the Trump thing. I'm serious. Google Trump narcissism. There was a whole debate on whether psychiatrists or people should be diagnosing him without ever having met him. But the way that his behavior manifests and the impact that it had was part and parcel to some of the personalities. Or that's my view. I was on that, but yeah. So I don't mean to be dismissive of that, but there is loads of stuff out there that you can read about.
I'm just going to say I'm just going to say the word stable genius.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, I'm gonna go through because we're approaching this sort of end. I did want to get, although that's a lot. Those questions might have come at the end. We've had them, so I'm gonna go through the rest of these. It's about maybe 10 more minutes or so, if you can bear with me. So, the crucial, how do we apply this to practice? Again, the break apart. But as we get to this stage, it's important to think, how can this, these ways of thinking and this information be applied to your own personal practice? So if we're looking at, working with people who work, in a context where you encounter substance misuse or learning disabilities, how do you think that this can be applied? And again, it's not deploying it to understand what's going on for the service users. It's about your colleagues and what's happening in your service and around you. So that's what this last section of thinking is about. So the special problems encountered in the workplace for those with personality disorder include a greater propensity to have time off sick and seek compensation, to have stress disorders of the workplace, to develop chronic disability, to have poor social functioning, and to deliberately lose jobs. In a broad review of the topic in 2010, Sansone and Sansone concluded that the twin problems of neuroticism and disagreeableness were the main factors responsible for occupational problems. So in your day-to-day, there might be the situation where someone is just always saying there's a problem with something, or your ideas are always wrong, or you can't seem to do anything right by this person. Or you might have someone who is chronically unwell. They always miss this meeting. They always do that. They always, it's again, that persistent, pervasive, and it's problematic because they need to be there. And when that is addressed, it leads to, and these things are not linked in this passage here, but it can lead to complaints or sick, or sort of lashing out at you if you try to feed back to someone something and they lash out at you. And not just once because they're having a rough day, but consistently lashing out and saying, and not being able to take feedback and not recognizing that you're trying to be constructive. That's when we begin to see how this behavior manifests in a professional practice context among colleagues. This list of sort of behaviors and events right here are what we can kind of look at. And they're kind of categorized and grouped in terms of neuroticism and disagreeableness. This idea, this sort of refusal, refusal suggests a conscious effort, but the inability to maintain constructive relationships with colleagues. And it doesn't have to be one particular one. It might be that every time a new person comes, this person doesn't get along with that person and doesn't give them a chance. It could be that every time a certain type of person comes, and this is where we get into the line of racism, sexism, and that sort of stuff. And not that sexism is not a personality disorder, but it could be that may not be sexism. It could be the fact that this person, going back to their relationship with their primary caregiver, who happened to be their mother, has a very unhealthy relationship or sort of connection with that particular figure. And so that produces some of the issues. It's not that they don't want to, or they don't, it's just that they can't because of where they're at. And these types of things I think are relevant because we do see them and they do exist and they do happen. And I think that oftentimes they don't get addressed because we don't know how to think about them. We maybe complain about the person, or we passively bully the person by talking about them, or we just kind of let it happen until someone else deals with it, rather than supporting the organization and the service user and the person through sort of embracing the idea that something is amiss and there's a way of understanding it, and this might be a constructive way of understanding it. And that's how we begin to sort of address some of the issues. I'm not suggesting this is a cure-all by any sense. I'm not saying that if you do this, then this will happen. I'm just suggesting that if we begin to start if some of this is resonating, or your people are popping into your head, or someone's popping in your head, the process begins with asking questions as to, well, what's going on for this person that prevents them from engaging in constructive professional relationships with the service, with me, with service users, or what have you. Okay, so that's kind of the point of that. Although personality disorders can cause extreme behavior, it's spectral, and it's a range, and it can be ordered that this includes normal functioning whose traits are unveiled when change occurs in their occupational or personal environment. So again, that's why I suggest that this is a crucial time, to recognize what's happening for colleagues, and to lend a supportive hand, and to really engage constructively when we're out of the historical context, because this might unveil something, or it might reveal something that's very important. And it also provides a time to engage in a very different way than you would have, a more controlled way, a more planned way. Okay. Personality disorders is one way to understand someone's behaviors that are arousing serious concerns. These can include excessive absenteeism, personality clashes, multiple grievances, drink problems, rudeness towards clients or colleagues, or change in behavior in response to work change. So it's one way to understand those things that have just been listed. And again, it's not about saying that person has a personality disorder. It's about maybe looking at some of the behaviors that they're exhibiting in the context of this diagnosis to understand, oh, that's what's going on, and then being able to kind of work with it, other than personalizing it or just kind of rejecting them out of hand and saying, well, that person's just an idiot, or this or that. It provides another alternative to conceptualizing behaviors that manifest in really challenging times, and previous behaviors as well. Okay. The last concept I want to go over is testimonial injustice. I know that we're running a little bit tight, so I'm going to probably be another 10 minutes on this, which will only leave 5 minutes for questioning, but we did have a chunk of questioning, so I'm happy with that the questions got asked. The idea of testimonial injustice and epistemic violence, this is a cornerstone of my own research, the idea of epistemic violence and testimonial injustice. And it's something that I think needs to frame what we're talking about. Testimonial injustice is a concept introduced by Miranda Fricker, where a subject is wrong in their capacity as a giver of knowledge. Examples might include not believing someone simply because of the color of their skin, class, gender, religion, etc. So the idea is that we don't believe someone's testimony because of a characteristic of who they are. Okay, this could be, oh, you're a woman, you won't understand. You might, some of you pick your group that you're in. Have you ever been in a meeting where you've said something that's just been ignored or dismissed? Okay, you've said a good idea, and then 5 months later, someone else says it, and it's a great idea, and that person's noticed to be different. Okay, it's the notion that because of your group, your testimony isn't as valid as someone else. Okay, you're not someone who can give knowledge. This often happens in our practice with service users. We view ourselves as the experts. Someone wants to tell you about themselves. We don't believe their testimony, particularly when we're talking about personality disorders and some of these more extreme diagnoses that seem to impair functioning in the mind. We tend to discount someone's knowledge based on a certain set of characteristics. So that's an important concept to understand, and something that does occur, the notion of testimonial injustice. The step further, and I think what's more important, is that it's not just the act of ignoring someone, but it can be perceived as what's called epistemic violence. And that's the infliction of harm against people through discourse, and also their erasure as beings of knowledge. It's not just not believing their testimony, it's just not believing they're capable of providing knowledge. So violence is exerted against or through knowledge, and it's probably one of the key elements of any process of domination. So we might oftentimes think that we're saying, when we say we need to disseminate knowledge or give people more knowledge, that we're being, benevolent or helpful, when that can also be interpreted as saying that they don't have any knowledge. Okay, and this damages a group's ability or a person's ability to be spoken or to be heard. And that's why when we go back to speaking in absolutes, when we're talking about these concepts and deploying these concepts, when we're talking about the essence of someone's being, their personality, and we are categorizing them in a certain way, we need to respect and understand, A, that it's important to hear what they have to say about what's going on, and B, that it can be perceived as a violent act if I'm defined a certain way. Because when you call someone personality disorder, call someone schizophrenic, call someone this, you're fundamentally changing who they are, through discourse. And that can be very harmful. So we want to avoid being violent. That's why I used the term weaponizing earlier. When we weaponize these concepts and we use them to explain who someone is categorically without accepting their perspective or their testimony, without recognizing that this might be harmful to them professionally, socially, or what have you, we might be perpetrators of violence. And this happens a lot in practice. So I want to drive home the point of being responsible by demonstrating the implications, if we're not responsible, okay? And that's the way to do that. Again, it brings us back to relationships. Within social work, which is my professional orientation, the sort of relational approach is gaining momentum, being acknowledged by by BASWA, by the International Federation of Social Workers. I strive more for a critical relational approach, if that wasn't obvious, but the notion is, the idea is that relationships are important. So the relationships we form with colleagues and service users are very important. However, they should be authentic, okay? And I think that's where all of this converges. We should not necessarily have to suffer through someone else's issues, okay? If someone is demonstrating, if you can find the labels that fit, we should not have to suffer through that and just kind of grin and bear it. That especially goes for, working in, mental health contexts, learning disabilities, older adults. We need to be able to have someone carry their own load, because it takes a lot of energy to work in that sort of dynamic. One of the sort of jokes slash kind of things we talk about in mental health is, if you find yourself talking about someone a whole lot, then you might want to start thinking in terms of these concepts. You're trying to figure out what's going on, what's wrong, what they're doing, all this other stuff. You might want to start thinking in these concepts. So the authentic part is where we acknowledge that, wow, this is a really challenging relationship. This is what may be going on, and it's consistent, and it's this and that, and we start naming it. So being someone who can be trusted, will give time to listen and believe, is crucial for building these types of relationships. So in the instance, you're not there to cure the person or fix them, but there is a way to engage by listening, giving some time. I didn't include setting boundaries, but that's another crucial one as well. So the relationships that we build, and this might go without saying, but I think it's really important, it goes back to that idea of relational capital, are vital. And if we have this sort of conceptual framework to understand what's happening to someone, we may not personalize it, because oftentimes we only think in these terms with respect to service users or vulnerable people or this or that, when really they can be applied to our own situations to help us understand. And that kind of leads to the final thing, which is the strategy. If we start noticing these pervasive patterns, if you're seeing someone that's consistently disengaging from work, and consistently isolating, along this sort of in the schizoid, in cluster A, schizoid, that might be a sign. It doesn't mean they have a schizoid personality disorder, but you can start to frame that as, wow, this person's quite avoidant of these specific things. I wonder what's going on, asking them to think about how they would feel were they to be treated in a similar way. Again, basic kind of principle conversations, but kind of effective, being able to say, wow, do you hear what you just said? Or do you see what's going on here? How would you feel? How does this make you feel? Having that kind of taking the time to engage in that dialogue. Encouragement and support to understand the behavior. Encouraging yourself, encouraging other people to understand what's going on, not just to jump to the conclusions. I know that this sounds like kind of pie in the sky because we're busy, and who really has time for this? I think that the reason that I suggest that is because in the long run, it becomes less problematic. In the short term, it might seem easier, but in the long run, it's more problematic to ignore something and let it become persistent and pervasive, or to not address it. So in real time kind of addressing this. Emphasizing positives, not at the omission of other things, but just building off of someone's positives as well, you know, making sure to include the ways that they can contribute. And that goes back to the idea that, you know, even though this might be going on, the person is still there and showing up, or maybe not, but the person is still engaging in some way, okay? And then identifying situations that bring out the best and reflecting on experiences, okay? These last few points are kind of well, they are the same, sorry. Don't know, there was a bit of repetition there, so sorry about that, kind of confused that. But that's kind of that's the strategy. So when you have kind of identified a situation where it might be useful to deploy this type of thinking, a strategy then becomes, what's the plan of action that we can use to address this? And I don't do a deep dive into that because it depends on your particular service, the particular person, but that's the way that I suggest that you can approach this, and it provides one way of thinking about this, okay? That's it. I hope that tied it together. If it didn't, I apologize. I didn't manage my time the most effectively, so I wanted to string it all together, but I also wanted to leave some time for people to get out on time, ask a few final questions if they wanted to. So,
Mark, thank you so much. I think that was a fantastic presentation, and I think the way that you made a connection between, you know, what we might have thought we were coming for, which was, you know, to have some help with categorizing personality disorder. You know, you transformed into a much broader discussion that you know, helped us to think about the importance of identifying continuums, but also, you know, that this is a topic that is as important for the way that we work with service users as it is for us thinking about our own situations, our own problems as individual practitioners, but also our relationships with our colleagues. And I think that the way that you curated all of that together was extremely interesting. There was is there time? I think there is still a little bit of time.
There's a few minutes, yeah.
And I can see that, you know, there's lots of messages coming in thanking you for what you've said, and you know, how people have enjoyed what they've heard. There was a question from Alexis, which was just a question about whether people can have more than one type within the different categories of personality disorder.
Yeah, I think that's, again, great question. And I just quickly want to say, before people start to peel off, I really appreciate the audience and your involvement. This is the first time I've done this in a webinar form. I usually do it in person. And, you know, as Chris will tell you, this can be quite intimidating when you don't have faces and you can't read the room. So I appreciate your questions and your engagement, and just want to thank you as a very supportive and encouraging audience. As far as the question goes, again, the way that it's set up makes it confusing. The new sort of way of thinking about this is dimensional. So there would be some overlap in how you think. So these concepts that I gave I presented them because even though they're outdated, they're still utilized within the services, and they still provide the conceptual foundation for how most people you will encounter in clinical practice will understand this. So that's why there's a separation. The new emerging way of thinking is dimensional, which means that you're not in a specific category that won't allow you to merge with another category. The way it is now, you're antisocial. You can't be antisocial and narcissistic. Although you can have traits of narcissism, they'll find a way of saying this is a person, but you will typically, for treatment and billing purposes, you might get diagnosed, but you would rarely be diagnosed with two personality disorders. So even though there's overlap, one would tend to be given weight over another in the sort of like long-standing way of thinking. In the newer way, there are dimensions that say you're severe and you have these sorts of traits, and those traits, you know, are kind of used generally. So does that answer your question?
And this would be an ICD-11, right?
Yes, that's the ICD-11. That last bit about the dimensions, the ICD-10 and the DSM-5. So the DSM-5 aligns is with the ICD-11, but kind of theoretically is very different. The ICD-10 is kind of outdated, but that's with the DSM-5. The NHS utilizes the thinking from some of the terminology is updated, but it utilizes the clusters come from the NHS, and mine. So they still haven't updated, because remember, this takes a lot. You've got to fundamentally change systems and ways of working and services and paperwork, administrate. It's a lot of work. So this will find its way in, you know what I mean? So that's why it's a little bit incongruent. So the concepts that I'm giving you are, according to the ICD, they're not outdated or not meant to be used, but they're encouraging a new way of thinking about this. This aligns with how the NHS currently does. But I encourage you to think. That's why I mentioned a lot, thinking in terms of dimensions and not being linear and that sort of stuff, because that's the way of thinking about it needs to be that way, even if we're deploying these terms to make sense of specific situations or specific encounters that we have with colleagues and or service users.
I'm just going to draw attention to the fact that Charles has kindly shared a feedback form, and I think, it's so great to hear from you about whether you've enjoyed the content today, whether there's more of the same that you'd like, or whether there are different things you'd like from the kinds of CPD that the teaching partnership are going to be able to provide in the future. So do let us know about that, and also about the format. It's really good to have feedback on the format. I mean, Mark said that the experience of being a presenter in these situations is interesting, and I mean, we've set up a format today in which we only gave you the opportunity to interact via chat. It could have been done a different way, but we've got an absolutely huge audience today. I think we had up to 80 people in the room at certain times during the session. So, there are things we can think about how we offer and operate these kinds of events that we'd really like to hear from you about, and what you think would work for you in the future. So I think we've really come to the end. Mark, I'd like to thank you so much. That was, you brought so much energy to our afternoon, and I think I'll leave the last word with you.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me, Chris, and Megan and Charles. You were very, very useful. And again, like I said, my own procrastination, a little sharing of the self there. But I do just, just want to send my best to everyone. We appreciate your work, and I think that goes unrecognized in times like this. And I think that the core principles of what I'm saying today, some of it kind of goes without saying, but I just really think it's important that as a shared profession, as individuals, as groups, we really do focus on really constructing positive relationships and trying to kind of help ourselves, because I think when we come through whatever the other side of this is going to be like, there's mumblings now of a time bomb. It's going to be crucial that we're restored enough to provide the support and work with people in a way that aligns with our professional values. And I don't think that that's possible or not as effective if we're draining ourselves. So to me, this was very rejuvenating, to have this, to be able to share this. I really do hope it was helpful. I wish everyone the best in terms of health and whatnot. And I appreciate you taking, like I said at the beginning, I know you've got loads of stuff to do. I appreciate you taking, a quarter of half of the day almost to come and, engage in this. And hopefully it was worthwhile.
Thanks, Mark. And just a very quick plug for the NELTP website. And I can see that Sandra has asked about whether there's any new research around the topic that Mark's been discussing today. And what I did want to say was that on the North East London Social Work Teaching Partnership website, we've now got an area where research that comes from both London Met and from UEL is being published. So, for example, student dissertations are there, as well as journal articles by academics. And we're trying to build a real repository of knowledge on the website there. So I think that's the place that we'd suggest that you go and look. And also, if you wanted to be able to share this session with colleagues who weren't able to be here today, we're providing recordings of all of the sessions that we do, which you can find in an archive there on the partnership website. So I think we'll close the session there. Thank you all very much.
Great. Thank you very much.